Okay, for number 20, it's asking us to find the domain of the function, and this is 20a. Okay, domain means all of the x values of the function. And you know, if you have a polynomial, x could be virtually anything. X could have any value. But when you have a rational expression, there are things that x can't be. And if you remember, x could not be here anything that would make my denominator 0, because those would be excluded values. Can't have 0 in the denominator of a fraction. So I need to know what would make this denominator equal to 0. And the way I can figure that out is to factor this, set each of my factors equal to 0, and solve for x. So the first thing I have to do is factor this trinomial. I don't have a leading coefficient, so I'm looking for what multiplies to negative 15 and adds to positive 2, and that's going to be 5 and negative 3. So this factors to x plus 5 times x minus 3. So I take each of those factors and I set it equal to 0. Set the next one equal to 0, and then solve. This makes x equal negative 5, and that makes x equals 3. So those are the two things that my denominator can't be. If we were solving for this, we would call those excluded values. If I solved and got them, I wouldn't be allowed to use them because they would make my denominator 0. But they didn't ask us to state the excluded values, they asked us to state the domain. And I'm going to do that in interval notation because that's generally how we state our domains, in interval notation. So the bottom line is x can be anything except these two numbers. So you could say all real numbers except negative 5 and 3, and that would answer the question. But if I want to state it in interval notation, my domain is equal to everything to the left of negative 5, so it starts at negative infinity and it ends at negative 5. It does not include negative 5 because it can't be negative 5, so I put a parenthesis there. Union, now it starts again at negative 5 but doesn't include it because it's everything right up to negative 5 on both sides of negative 5. So it starts at negative 5, and the fact that I have parentheses next to both of those tells me that negative 5 is not included. It goes right up to 3 because it's everything between negative 5 and 3, but again the parentheses tells me 3 is not included. And then I have to account for all the things to the right of 3, so I union 3, and then it takes me to infinity. So really I've said x is everything from negative infinity to positive infinity except negative 5 and positive 3. And the way I stated that they were not included was by putting the parentheses next to them. Those endpoints are not included. Again, it's everything between negative and positive infinity except negative 5 and positive 3. Okay, for b, they're asking us to find the domain of the equation y equals the square root of 5 minus 3x. And when they're asking you for the domain, they're asking you for the real number, in the real number system. So if we're talking about the real number system, what can I not get under a radical sign or a square root? Under a square root, I cannot have a negative number. So that means I can have 0 or a positive number, but not a negative number. So if I can have 0 or a positive number, then I'm going to say 5 minus 3x has to be greater than or equal to 0. So when I solve that, that will be what it can be, and my domain will be everything that it can be. So here I'm going to solve for x. I subtract 5 from both sides. I know you know how to solve for this x. That gives me negative 3x is greater than or equal to negative 5. I divide by negative 3. I'll move up. Oop, I extended my page. I hope that works. I divided by negative 3, so that cancels and gives me x. I have to change the direction of my inequality because I'm dividing across it by a negative, so it's going to be less than or equal to positive 5/3. So if it's less than or equal to positive 5/3, then my domain is going to be, again, in interval notation. If it's everything less than 5/3, it's everything to the left of 5/3, which means it starts at negative infinity, which of course doesn't have an endpoint, so I use a parentheses, and it goes up to that positive 5/3, and because it has to be less than or equal to that, it can include that. When my endpoint is included, I use brackets. So again here, the whole idea was this could not be negative. If it couldn't be negative, it could be 0 or positive, which means it had to be greater than or equal to 0. And there's my domain.